Hello and a warm welcome to the CNBC Africa special coming to you live from Davos, Switzerland, where the World Economic Forum is currently in session. Over the last 15 years, we've seen the African continent gathering momentum from a growth perspective and achieving over 5% for the last 2 years, which is well above the global average. What is even more exciting is that according to the African Development Bank, we're on target to hit 5.3% for 2013. The region has also bounced back quickly from the 2008-2009 global financial crisis and is now the second fastest growing economy in the world. The key question at this point is whether the continent can sustain this growth. And it's against this background that we focus our debate on de-risking Africa. Have African countries made the right investment decisions and put the right policies in place to continue this exciting growth story? Joining me today to delve deeper into these issues are His Excellency Jacob Zuma, President of South Africa, His Excellency Goodluck Jonathan, President of Nigeria, Sunil Mittal, the Chairman and CEO of the Bharti Enterprises Group, Louise, Arbour, President and CEO of the International Crisis Agency, and Graham Mackay, the Executive Chairman of SAB Miller. Thank you all so much for joining me. President Zuma, if I may start with you. The biggest risk, in your opinion, to sustaining growth on the African continent at current levels?
Well, thank you very much in the first instance. Well, I may start on the wrong footing because I've been questioning myself about the topic.
You don't like the topic. It's not a good place to start.
De-risking Africa. Is Africa risky more than any other region in the world? I think, yes, you say yes.
Murmurs in the audience at this point.
Somebody will have to explain to me because it looks like there's a perception about Africa which needs to be dealt with. Hence the topic. If you yourself were saying it has been growing, it has bounced back very quickly, and I would imagine not less than other regions of the world. I think there's evidence that Africa is growing. There's also evidence that African leaders have collectively come together to do things that is going to make Africa to move forward. We have collectively dealt with the issue of democracy in the continent of Africa. We are entrenching democratic rule. We have also dealt with the issue of the infrastructure because we realized that the colonial legacy left us different or acting differently whilst we're in one continent. We have taken a decision to grow our infrastructure, to grow our intra-trade. We are moving to integrate the 5 economic regions in the continent. And from our point of view, we are doing everything that we believe is right to ensure that our continent moves forward. That's why I've got a problem with the topic. And somebody said, yes, they will explain to me, what is it that is a risk that you need to come and say, how do we de-risk Africa? I say I take issue with that because I think Africa is moving correctly as a continent.
An appropriate answer, Mr. President. You don't believe there is any risk to the economic growth that we're enjoying? Point taken. Let's hear from President Jonathan. So do you believe there is a challenge to that 5.3% growth rate? And Mr. President Zuma, I have to bring into the debate at this juncture that if we remove South Africa from the equation, that growth rate is pushed up to 6%, not 5.3%. Moving on, Mr. Not good to challenge a moderator in the early stages. No. President Jonathan, my apologies, sir.
Well, thank you. I wouldn't question the wisdom in selecting the topic, de-risking Africa. But of course, in any investment or any venture, there's always risk in business. So not just Africa, there's risk anywhere in the world, depending on the circumstances. But President Zuma already expressed the key thing. Before this time, African states were quite politically unstable. You had military interventions, and where government is not stable, where the political system is not stable, it's a big risk in terms of investment because laws could be changed arbitrarily. And that is the emphasis President Zuma had said. Over the period, most of the African states have stable political systems. presently, about 33 African states have conducted successful elections 2 times, where one civilian administration has handed over to another one. In Nigeria, we've done our elections 4 times. We never experienced that. So in terms of political stability, the African continent has been reasonably de-risked because governments are stable. And because the political system is stable, it also affects the economic planning. If you look at it before this time, we had a lot of volatility in terms of the economic indices. Inflation was very staggering. In terms of exchange rates, unpredictable. But now most countries, exchange rate has been reasonably stable. So businessmen can make predictions. In terms of inflation, of course, in Nigeria, we are trying to we are now 11 point, little above 11. We want to make sure that we maintain single digit. And it cut across most of the African countries. Before this time, the growth rate has been very stagnant, just like Zuma said. But over the periods, the growth rate of a number of African countries is significantly above the world average. Countries like, of course, Ethiopia, Ghana, Niger, even Liberia, though they are small economies. But in terms of the growth, it's quite significant. That shows a focus and a promise. So,
President Jonathan, can I interrupt there?
Yeah.
You are largely Nigeria, an oil-producing economy.
Yes.
Isn't one of the single biggest risks facing you a continued global economic meltdown?
Yes, in terms of oil, any country that depends on one major commodity is a big risk, because anything that affects the oil production or the global oil price, it affects us. Of course, that is one aspect, and that's why we are looking to different areas. One of our key programs that we want to market here in Davos is agri transformation, solid mineral and others. We have the potential, but somehow some years back, of course, that has to do with also the political stability, because the country was not politically stable. We had military government, and if you take over power, all what you want is quick money to satisfy the people. So there was no investment in other areas. They could just exploit the oil, of course.
We're going to come back to that, President Jonathan. Sunil, if I can move to you at this point. You operate in 17 countries on the African continent, largely in the telecommunications space. When you see negative news flow hitting the headlines, how do you feel about your African investments?
You know, as investors, a very significant investor in Africa, one looks at the political leadership at the end of the day. Let me start with the good news. I think the Africa continent and most of the nations welcome foreign investment. When I moved in 3 years back, I was amazed at the welcome we received in every country, including Nigeria. And it is no small matter that our fastest launch anywhere in the globe was in Rwanda, and I'd like to acknowledge President Kagame, who's here. In 83 days flat, from day 0 to 83 days, we launched mobile services. That's a record. The amount of support we got from President's office and the telecom ministry was outstanding. Similarly, in Nigeria of late, we see a lot of stress in the upper north, where Boko Haram have been targeting cell sites, switching centers, and the support that we have received from the government has been tremendous. Security has been beefed up, people have been reassured, especially foreigners who are working there, and that's what counts in the end. Will Africa have issues from time to time, which will scare investors, which will worry investors? That's a fact of life. There are some pockets, new one developing in Mali now, upper Nigeria, some other parts of Congo on the northwestern border. Issues will be there. But investors go with the eyes open. The opportunity is big. The price to be won in the end is very big. And the growth is there. At the end of the day, all emerging markets offer growth. But today, really, the last bastion of big growth is the African continent. 1 billion people, of which 500 million are connected, and 500 million are yet to be connected. And those who are connected want to move up to the next level of mobile internet. And that's what excites investors like us. I would say on balance, risk of growth is limited because Africa will grow. People are aspiring for more products and more services. Yes, commodity prices have weakened. That's one area of concern. Because of global position, most of the commodities have weakened, and Africa relies very heavily on commodities. The international aid into Africa has slowed down because Europe and US are not putting that much money. But that may shave off 0.5%, 0.75%. And we'll come back as soon as the world comes back into good shape. But the commitment that people like us have made into various African countries is there for good. We want to expand in Africa. And I can endorse that from an investing community point of view, we are very happy about the support and active participation of the government in our issues that we get from time to time.
It looks as though I'm going to have to change the debate topic because none of the panelists are happy with it, but let's proceed at this point. Louise, your organization, Prevention and Resolution of Deadly Conflict. What is your opinion of the African continent?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize, as others have said so far, is the tremendous and encouraging success story in Africa in the last decade on the economic front. Christine Lagarde of the IMF was speaking recently in Côte d'Ivoire, and she declared that enemy public number one in Africa was conflict. And frankly, I think the two presidents here would probably acknowledge that they're spending a surprising amount of their time in the sub-regional organizations that were designed to promote economic growth, economic integration, so ECOWAS and SADC and IGAD. These organizations now are being, I think it's fair to say, pretty distracted by the problem of conflict management. So they were originally designed as sort of economic development models, and now they're increasingly drawn in to the question of conflict management, conflict prevention. I think the other point to make is we sometimes, in a very superficial way, identify the ostensible causes of conflict in a range of facets. Piracy off the coast of Somalia, and increasingly in the Gulf of Guinea, less well exposed. Competition for resources, radical Islamist militancy. There's a whole range of increased criminality, penetration of organized crime. But behind these ostensible sort of conflict drivers, I think there's a commonality of issues that the continent still is struggling to address at different levels or to different degrees. I think the first one is issues of governance, most importantly, political and economic exclusion, and finally, still very weak institutions. So to varying degrees in varying countries, these underlying issues, I think, continue to pose a very, very serious challenge, not to the immediate dividends of economic growth, but if the dividends of prosperity and of democracy are not shared equitably.
Louise, we're going to come back to that point. Graham, if I can bring you in at this point, SAB Miller has been operating on the African continent for 20 years. Some 36 countries you're exposed through the Castell relationship and directly into 15 countries. Share your experience and how you feel as a significant investor on the continent.
Well, I don't want to join the ranks of those who are challenging the moderator, but of course we've been in Africa for 115 or 125 years, whatever it is now, because we come from South Africa, which is very much part of the continent, of course.
So rest of Africa.
The rest of Africa.
Can I come back?
Your
Rest
remarks
Africa,
are
20 years?
Absolutely accurate about the rest of Africa.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, that's quite right. You know, this thing about de-risking Africa, I mean, our perspective on it is this really, that, you know, we are in Africa, we're of Africa. I come from South Africa, our business comes from South Africa. And so we are there, as you might say, boots and all, and always have been. As far as the rest of Africa is concerned, outside South Africa, where we started expanding when we could, which is effectively as apartheid started to crumble. In my perspective, it's not so much a question of de-risking, it's taking the brakes off. What is already remarkable economic progress by removing some of the bottlenecks. I mean, as an example of that, I don't know of any part of Africa where we could have invested because we thought there was demand and didn't for risk factors. We were the first investor into South Sudan, I think of any kind. Great big brewery there next to Juba just after independence. And what is interesting is that we obviously assessed all the risk factors which were there and are still there in South Sudan. But that brewery went in relatively small, It ran out of capacity within 6 months. We doubled it. It ran out of capacity again within a year. We've doubled it again. And we will no doubt double it again within the next couple of years. So that's what you get. And what you have in Africa is huge demand because consumption levels are very low. You have hundreds of millions of people coming into the cash economy and looking for high-quality commercial goods. So for us, we don't hold back on investment because of risk factors. We invest as we think the markets can grow.
What happened in Kenya, Graham?
In Kenya?
In Kenya specifically. Didn't SAB Miller have quite a tough time with regard to East African
Yeah, we did.
breweries?
But in Kenya, there was a relatively big competitor there on the ground. So Kenya is not a country that was coming up from relatively levels of poverty compared to the rest of the continent. We built a brewery, and as was mentioning earlier in respect of Nigeria, it's very difficult to ramp up a brewery to full utilization in most countries from a standing start. Now, it didn't work in Kenya, but some years later it worked very well in South Sudan. It's just worked very well in Nigeria, actually.
I want to pick up with President Jonathan here. Is there a risk that the situation, the turmoil in Mali right now, and perhaps even Algeria, which is in North Africa, could spill over to further unrest in West Africa specifically?
Definitely, if you look at the situation in Mali, if it is not contained, definitely it will spill into the West African countries, Central African countries, and of course, North African countries. And when you look at the situation in Mali, it worsened because of the crisis we had in Libya. If Libya was relatively stable, if we never had those crises in Libya, the situation in Mali would have been a little better than what it is. Well, we know we have fundamental problems in Mali, the issue of governance issues and so on, and religious extremism. But the terror aspect and the issue of hostage taking, especially for purpose of ransom, and drug traffickers and gun runners, it worsened because of the crisis in Libya. And of course, the terrorists, they always want to instigate crisis because they make money through that. And if we don't contain the problem in northern Mali, definitely it will affect other countries. And that's one of the reasons why Nigeria has to move fast. And we have to thank the government of France for helping.
President Zuma, if I can refer now to the World Economic Report, the Competitiveness Report 2012-2013. The good news is that South Africa ranks as the top performing economy in sub-Saharan Africa at position number 52. However, weak points, security, crime, violence. If you look at labor tensions, labor-employer tensions, we rank at 144. Now, there were only 144 economies surveyed. So we are experiencing security issues, especially with those labor tensions. What do we need to do to prevent the situation from deteriorating further?
Well, we are discussing the matter. All stakeholders are discussing the matter. We have had a meeting where we all met to say, how do we address the issues that were prevailing? As of course you'd appreciate, the labor bubbles that you saw in South Africa, what is it that led to that? Because it is important to understand that where is the origin of this. The labor situation was very calm until one mining company, despite an agreement between labor and the particular companies, was 3 years. There will be no negotiation, which was the first time, which was an advance, in fact, in terms of the labor negotiations and, as we call it, the bargaining system in our country.
You're talking now about Anglo Platinum and the 14,000 potential job losses.
That's the latest. I'm talking about what led to Marikana. Then the company decides, despite the agreement, to conduct negotiations with a particular union and then reach an agreement, which then threatened the agreement that was in existence. Other workers began to say, if you could reach this agreement, why not us? That's what sparked off the labor unrest. Because if we put it as if it is just mushroomed from nowhere, then once again it gives a wrong impression that there was either the lack of governance in the country that led to the labor unrest. Not at all. It came from the private sector that led to the Marikana.
May I set a little context here for the audience? Those of you who don't know about Marikana, an event happened, wildcat strikes at Lonmin, one of the platinum producers in South Africa, on the 16th of August 2012, resulting, sadly, in 47 deaths.
Yes,
just
that's
a little
the point
context.
I'm talking about. That began to make the mining industry get into trouble, because then that which was backed off by the undermining of the agreement led to workers saying, if others could get it, why not? And they went up. The manner in which it came, it began to undermine the bargaining system, which was there as good governance of the country. Undermined by what? By how a company negotiated with a particular union that led to the problem. That is what brought that kind of problem.
So, Mr. President, what is the solution?
The solution is that we are discussing the matters. To begin to come back to the system, which was functioning very well, destabilized by those who wanted to undermine it, to say, let us get back to the governance of the labor system in the country. Let us not undermine the bargaining system, which was undermined. Because Marikana led to another negotiation, which was outside the bargaining system, which reached a particular agreement.
Do you think, Mr. President, we've seen the worst of labor tensions in South Africa?
Yes, we have seen the worst. We are no longer going to the worst. We are dealing with the matters. All of us, organized labor, business, the government, we are dealing with it to correct it, because it cannot go back to a situation which creates an impression that there is no governance of this matter.
Mr. President, cognizant of time, Louise, I want to come back to you before we go to the break. And with one eye on Mali and the situation unfolding there, we have said President Jonathan has reiterated they are watching that territory carefully. They thank France for their intervention. What are your thoughts? Are we going to see this turmoil destabilizing West Africa?
Well, I think what we're seeing now is an increasing engagement in essentially the opening of a second major theater of the war on terror. The danger, of course, with an extreme focus on a very heavy military response is that it may obscure the original political grievances that were very present in Mali and I think exist in the neighboring states. So you have essentially what was, and I agree with President Jonathan that the fallout from Libya was, to some extent, an additional trigger. Weapons came in the hands of Tuaregs, who originally had an agenda, not necessarily secessionist, but the claims for autonomy for the North. And this was immediately, very rapidly hijacked by Islamist militant groups that have tremendous capacity.
Without going into the detail, again, apologies, I am cognizant of time. Is there a risk that the turmoil will destabilize West Africa?
Well, it already is. I think there is a tremendous risk, but there's also a risk that it will obscure the real issues of the reconstruction of the state in Bamako and so on. So I think there's also a danger that militarization will take a life of its own. And for many in West Africa, on the continent generally, the main source of insecurity, I can assure you, of women and many men in Africa and elsewhere, doesn't come from the fear of the war on terror.
Louise, thank you very much. Time for a short break. When we return, we continue with our live discussion on de-risking Africa. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching CNBC Africa, coming to you live from the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland. Today we're focusing on the strategies needed to sustain economic growth on the African continent. On our panel, His Excellency Jacob Zuma, President of South Africa, His Excellency Goodluck Jonathan, President of Nigeria, Sunil Mittal, Chairman and Group CEO of Bharti Enterprises, Louise Arbour, President and CEO of the International Crisis Agency, and Graham Mackay, Executive Chairman of SAB Miller. Graham, if we can turn now to private sector solutions. If we look at the resource environment and we look at solutions around de-risking the resource environment in particular, and here you deal with the threats of nationalization. Why? Because we have huge gaps between the haves and the have-nots on the African continent and globally. Do you have any solutions to table?
Well, I'm certainly far from an expert on the resources sector because obviously my company is in the consumer goods
I do
sector.
know that, sir, but from a private sector perspective, you must have been watching the resource environment and the hot issues unfolding.
Yes, I don't have any pat solutions to that. You've just described the problem. I think that the way that we see Africa can improve its lot throughout is through economic growth. And so we are in favor of anything that speeds up economic growth. And I mean, the central message, I think, of all of these proceedings is that Africa is growing at 5 or 6 or whatever the number is %. Our businesses in Africa are growing somewhat faster than that. But if you compare that to what could happen if certain bottlenecks were taken out, I can easily see that doubling, getting up
What
to
bottlenecks
Asia.
are you referring to?
Well, there are a number. I mean, Louise mentioned what we call soft infrastructure, which is essentially governance and tax regimes, law, rule of law, and that sort of thing. I would rank even further ahead of that from our point of view, hard infrastructure, because we encounter the problems of that all the time. Roads, bridges, electricity supplies, water supply, refuse removal, sewage, electricity reticulation in particular, all of that stuff. If you look at some of our operations in the more remote parts of Africa and you see the conditions that have to be endured for the products to get to market and for the raw materials to come in, and even more for them to cross borders where they need to cross borders, these require heroic endeavors in many cases. So the remarkable thing, I think, about all of this is that Africa, despite some of these problems in much of the continent, is growing as fast as it is already. And that could, in my estimation, be doubled quite easily.
Sunil, do you agree hard infrastructure, one of our biggest challenges? Now, if I can just quote a stat here, we're looking at funding requirements of $93 billion annually to 2020 to fund the infrastructure deficit. It's been well documented. Can we solve this crisis? Because it is a crisis. And if we do close that infrastructure gap, we can add 2% to overall African economic growth.
Well, I will absolutely agree with that proposition. And my own view is even $93 billion may not be good enough. It's a very large continent. It's got a lot of catching up to do. Even India, where we have caught up on infrastructure, we have a long way to go. The commitment in the next 7 or 8 years is $1 trillion on hard infrastructure. So Africa will need a lot of investment in infrastructure, and I would agree with my co-panelist here. That is, to my mind, the biggest risk to Africa's growth factor. If you can have hard infrastructure in place, and that is where, to my mind, the governments must concentrate, go for the broke, get as much investment as possible in power generation of various kinds, road infrastructure, movement and transit of goods within Africa. I move things between these 17 countries. It's very tough. It's time-consuming. It's expensive. We go out, build towers into the rural areas. There is no electricity. It's difficult to haul equipment into these rural places. There are no roads. So can you imagine if Africa would start investing heavily into infrastructure, what can it do to uplifting people from poverty, the economic growth rate that is required there? So to my mind, the single biggest factor that you have and some other panelists have identified remains focus on infrastructure.
President Jonathan, you're hearing it now from the private sector, so I know it is key on your agenda. What solutions are you tabling from a West African perspective?
Yeah, definitely, of course, the issue, I can't debate it, the infrastructure gap is significant in Africa. And of course, that is why trades between African countries is quite limited, because it's easier to move from African countries to Europe and the rest of the world than to move from one African country to the other. And until you meet up that gap, you will not encourage trade within Africa. But the issue of infrastructure is expensive, what has been taken at the level of the individual states and the sub-regions and the continent itself. Under the Organization African Unit, the African Union, it's also have a committee, I think Zuma is even a part of it, working on how we'll meet up this gap. It requires heavy investments. At the Economic Community of West African States level, the ECOWAS level, we are also working on that. At the individual countries, we are working on that because we
Perhaps
believe
I can get President Zuma at this stage. So you are leading the charge for the African Union, heading up solutions to the infrastructure problem that we face. Could you elaborate?
Yes, we are. We are certainly. As I said earlier, what is fortunate is that collectively, the AU has taken very concrete decisions with regard to the infrastructure of different types. And many of my colleagues who are here are part of it. Senegal and Rwanda, we are part of that committee. Because we realized that the unfortunate history of the continent separated us because we were designed in terms of the mother countries. And we realized that the intertrade was not enough. And we are working hard on that. There are very clear decisions. We have, in fact, moved. That's why I wanted to respond to some of the issues that were raised about subcontinents.
Please go ahead, Mr. President.
Subcontinents consumed to the issues of conflict. It's not just that they deal with that only. We are also dealing with economic issues. We have just discussed and agreed to integrate 3 of the 5 economic regions, creating a huge market that we are dealing with. And we have calculated and actually said there must be a common kind of market because we are looking at the economy.
This is the free trade area you're alluding to.
Yes, free trade area of 3 that brings a huge, almost more than
over half a billion people.
Exactly, that's a point. Those are the economic activities we are undertaking. And insofar as the infrastructure is clear, we are moving to deal with border problems so that there should be free flow of goods among ourselves and with the world at large.
I have to interrupt you, Mr. President, because I say at Davos this has got to be more than a talk shop. Now, I got extremely excited about the Inga Dam project, the hydroelectric project that could solve the continent's power problems, supplying uninterrupted power to most of the continent. And I tabled it with my chief editor back in Johannesburg, and he said to me, Bronwyn, I've been writing about the Inga Dam project for 2 decades. So when are we going to see it coming to reality?
It is going to come to reality very soon. I think we signed an agreement with the DRC last year, the year that is just passed, to take it forward. It's not an easy one, but we are dealing with it. There's also a collective of SADC that is looking at it. We are very much aware of the openings that Inga project is going to make. It's one issue that we're going to be discussing very concretely after the summit. We have agreed with the DRC, Angola, and South Africa to discuss it once again to take the step forward, particularly because the region is very concerned that we move on that matter. So it's one of the contributing elements that are going to come in the economy because of the energy that it's going to bring to almost to the rest of the continent.
Sunil, are you seeing changes in the infrastructure space on the continent?
Yes, some countries more than others. Ghana is a fine example. Rwanda is doing extremely well in moving on infrastructure. Nigeria in pockets. South Africa, of course, already has has taken a big lead in infrastructure and carries on doing so. But it is DRC, it is Niger, it's Chad, it's Sierra Leone. So there are countries where we operate where there is really a long lead that needs to be covered. And that's what I was alluding to, that I hope governments in countries which have fallen behind in the last decade or so need to step up.
Graham, coming back to your experience, 150 in South Africa, 20 into the rest of Africa. Over that time, sir, have you seen hard changes on the infrastructure front?
Well, I would agree with Sunil. Yes, there are some changes. But if you were to ask me, are the infrastructure investments keeping up with economic growth? I'd say no. I would say that on balance, and I'm generalizing because you've asked me to, on balance, the infrastructure deficit is widening rather than narrowing, from what I observe in my trips around Africa. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that. In fact, hard infrastructure is not really South Africa's problem. South Africa has very good hard infrastructure compared to the rest of Africa, and in fact, compared to many other countries around the world, more developed countries. But if you take the rest of Africa, by and large, it's a big problem. And it's all the things I mentioned. It's electrification, it's reliable electricity supply, reliable water supply, and all the rest. So there are investments being made, but I don't think they're keeping up with the economic growth.
Louise, you'd like to add?
Well, I just want to warn that I think sort of mega economic projects, just like a major step in the advancement of democracy, can create conflict environments, in part because they raise tremendous expectations, particularly in the very communities in which they have their footprint, where the dividends don't come back to these communities. And I think it's the same thing with the growth of democracy that we've seen. I mean, I think most people here would agree that elections are a public good, but they're also, they can trigger conflict. We've seen it certainly in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, in recent times. Both countries are about to engage in a second round of elections. So you can have public goods and sort of major economic investments and developments, which could be seen as a good, not always a public good, a mixed public and private good, but can also, I think, trigger tremendous conflict opportunities and some legitimate grievances, particularly, again, when the dividends of democracy and prosperity are not equitably shared.
President Jonathan, that brings us to political stability. And perhaps the question here is, when are we going to see free and fair elections across the African continent where the losing party doesn't question the validity of the voting system?
Yeah, before I come to that, I think I need to mention a particular thing about the issue of infrastructure. Because when we met at the Commonwealth level in Australia, just as I mentioned, the AU itself is quite involved. I think Ike is the part. We are working on the private sector. I think Ike from Nigeria, MD of Access Bank, is part of that committee. Because not only government that can provide that, so we are exploiting the participation of the private sector. It's quite challenging, but definitely gradually we get there. The issue of election, yes, of course, Nigeria is a very good example. I've told you that we have had 4 elections, 1999, 2003, 2007, and 2011. But if you look at the trend of elections, 2011, it was quite acceptable by all observers, both local and international observers. Even when the opposition challenged the elections, both the appeal court and the Supreme Court, the highest courts, all the justices said that the elections were free and fair. So that is the beginning. Africa is coming from a point where you had military dictatorship, and of course, in some cases, civilian dictatorship. So to completely democratize, it's not something you do overnight. But that is one of the key things that the regional bodies, ECOWAS, SADC, and others, are insisting. And of course, you remember the case in Cote d'Ivoire. Then I was the chairman of the Authority of Head of States and Government of the ECOWAS sub-region. And immediately elections declared that, of course, Ouattara was supposed to win. Even Gbagbo refused to go. We said, no, you must go.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I've got to go to the floor at this stage. I've got a very strict director in my ear. I notice that President Kagame of Rwanda is in our midst. And so if I could just set the stage for Rwanda. In terms of the World Economic Forum's competitiveness report, Rwanda currently sitting in 63rd place, moving up 7 positions. And just to give you an indication, we're looking at a country now that has moved from a 1994 genocide situation, which has turned around corruption, it has got sound financial institutions, and in that context, at number 63, it is the 3rd most competitive economy in sub-Saharan Africa. President Kagame, your comments, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me go straight to the point relating to the subject matter under discussion, de-risking Africa. And I will straight away compliment my brothers, heads of state there, and other panelists, and agree with them in many ways as to what they have said. But let me quickly try and contextualize de-risking Africa. And I think people who say, no, we don't agree with putting it that way may be right. But let me put it differently, if I may. First of all, investment risk is present in Africa. as it is in the rest of the world. So you'll find different risk levels relating to investment made in different places, but they will be anywhere you want to make investments. That's number one. And there are other problems in Africa. They have been said: infrastructure, institutional capacity, and other issues. And I think Africa is getting better at addressing all those. And Africans are willing and ready and want to improve on all those. But I have to go to another point. De-risking Africa and considering both economic and political aspects of that, for me, the major problem I see is that Africa's story is written from somewhere else and not by Africans themselves. This is the major point. And that's why the rest of the world looks at Africa and wants to define it. They want to shape the perception about Africa.
President Kagame, they're telling me 9 minutes left for the debate in total.
Okay,
so
let me just say 1 minute and I'll be done.
Thank you.
So for me, the best thing we can do for ourselves is to own our problems and own our solutions and write our own story. And that will also give the right definition about the levels of risk and the real risks, whether real risk, and then the perception part of it coming from outside will also be put in its right place. That's all I wanted to.
Thank you very much, President Kagame. Yes, sir, I've got a question here.
Martin Richenhagen, Chairman and CEO of Eco Corporation, the owner of Massey Ferguson Farm Equipment. I have a question to President Jonathan. The risk of social instability is increasing due to the fact that the population of Africa is growing very rapidly. What is Nigeria's contribution to improve food security?
President Jonathan?
Thank you. I think it's even good. Maybe I'll invite you for our next program that we are trying to bring their own agri-transformation to Davos. It's one of the key things Nigeria have this year. And we are revolutionizing agriculture. Over the period, I agree with you, that Nigeria, even as a nation, if you take a grain that is eaten by almost everybody on earth, rice, Nigeria as a nation can produce enough rice to feed the rest of Africa. So many African countries have that. Nigeria has a kind of ecological system from the ocean down to the semi-desert area, with even elevated areas where you can grow very cool crops. But because of poor investment, and because we've been looking at agriculture as if it is a development project, poverty alleviation program, so agric has not been well emphasized. And our new transformation is that we're looking at agric as a business where you create wealth, not reducing poverty. And of course, we'll make a presentation. If you come and listen to the Minister of Agriculture, we'll be quite pleased. And we have the plan. For now, Nigeria is the biggest importer of rice on the continent. But by 2015, 2016, we will stop importing. That is just
And it's a big opportunity for the private sector because
Very
of your
big for the private
demands
sector.
on the food front. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Hi, Sam White, co-founder of Promethean Power in Mumbai. My question is about the influence of China. When you do consider an investment and you think about the short-term economic benefit and the long-term environmental impact, which way do you usually go?
In terms of environmental impact, there's nothing you do on Earth that has no negative effect. But everything has to do with balancing. While you're focusing to the future, you must also meet the demands of the present, but you'll not compromise the present. Of course, that is the concept of sustainable development and environmental issues. So in as much as we want to develop, we want to provide our needs, we are also mindful about the future. So we balance.
Any other questions from the floor? Thank you very much. If we could get a microphone.
Hi,
Go ahead, sir.
My name is Ashish Thacker. I'm the founder of Mara Group. We have investments in 19 African countries. And I concur with what the presidents have said and the business leaders, and especially what President Kagame said. However, one issue that I do see as a risk is we have a very large young unemployment issue, especially amongst the youth. And as foreign direct investment is one solution, obviously nurturing small and medium enterprises is a critical solution. So understanding better what the governments are doing to kind of encourage this more, to create more of an enabling environment for the young entrepreneurs in particular.
President Zuma, can I ask you to respond, sir?
Well, it is firstly, it's a global issue, the issue of the unemployment of the youth. That's part of my problem, that everything is sort of pigeonholed to Africa, as if it does not exist in other countries. It's a problem that affects everybody else. And given the issues that we are dealing with in Africa, if colonialism left us with a legacy of no infrastructure, the kind of countries had borders because they have their mother countries, those are the issues we are dealing with. The solution is to grow the economy. The infrastructure program that we are dealing with, which is going to absorb the young people who are professionals today on a number of those kind of aspects. That's part of what we're going to do globally in terms of the continent. In South Africa, we are discussing that issue very specifically in the structure that is called NEDLEC, wherein government, labor, the private sector, and civil society, we are discussing how do we deal with this issue. The government had come with a program that this is what we're going to do to address the issue of the youth. The unions were unhappy. They thought it would threaten their jobs. We did not want to impose
President Zuma, I've got this talk clicking in my ear. My apologies, sir.
Okay.
I'm going to move to closing comments from my panelists, and if we can keep them brief. I know you don't like the topic, de-risking Africa, so we've set that stage. But President Jonathan, let's start with you. On closing comments, move through to Sunil, to Louise, and to Graham, and then concluding with President Zuma.
Okay, I have to thank you for this opportunity, but maybe talking about the unemployment Zuma mentioned. In Nigeria, we have different products, but one of the areas where we think and we are trying to use to generate jobs is to encourage the young men and women to employ themselves by creating medium-level entrepreneurship, by encouraging them to come with business proposals and funded by government. So with that, we're projecting that any young man who benefits from that may be able to employ 1 to 10 people. And when we run that program for some years, the level of unemployment will definitely decrease. That's one major area. And the second is our agricultural transformation, which we project that between now and 2015, we're expecting that 3 to 4 million young people will be involved in commercial agriculture, not subsistence agriculture that we're used to know.
Thank you so much, President Jonathan. Sunil.
Well, I think the narrative in Africa is changing, and changing very fast, and there's no question that you are seeing more and more countries moving on to the democratic process, moving up on the growth curve, looking at youth employment, all these issues. From the standpoint of investors and people who are coming into Africa, I think what is important to see is commitment from the political leadership to secure investments, ensure there are no major fallouts of any terror activities which have recently developed. Importantly, manage foreign exchange in a manner which does not deliver shocks. Repatriation of profits and dividends should become the norm. And if you look at India, which has gone through decades of financial sector reforms, develop robust financial sector, deeper stock markets, and I think the rest will follow.
Louise?
Well, since I think there's a large consensus that there's cause to celebrate the economic position that Africa finds itself in, maybe I'll just say a few words about this so-called soft infrastructure of governance, and particularly coming back to the question of elections. I think it's true that there's been tremendous technical progress in the holding of so-called free and fair elections. It's not all that clear, and I'm not speaking exclusively about Africa, it just happens to be the topic here today. It's very true elsewhere that there's more to free and fair elections than technically correct polls. There have to be elections with integrity, and on that, I think as we see elections looming in Africa now, we should remember that in the short term, elections are very risky and when they threaten entrenched, powerful elites, but in the long term, they're even riskier when they don't.
Louise, thank you so much. Graham, concluding statement, sir.
Trust in economic growth to solve the problems of the continent. Economic growth comes from the private sector. It comes from business. We've talked about the obstacles. These exist all over the world, but we're talking about Africa, and the three obstacles of hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, and trade barriers. I would direct all our efforts to trying to overcome those, because business will fix it eventually, if it's allowed to.
Thank you so much to my esteemed panelists. A round of applause, I think, is appropriate at this stage. Thank you so much for joining us for this live CNBC Africa debate, coming to you from Davos, Switzerland, where the World Economic Forum is currently in session. To borrow from one of the colleagues at the World Bank, who said the Africa train has left the station. If you're not on it, you stand the risk of becoming irrelevant. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.